and welcome to this tutorial on shaping behavior change. This tutorial is adapted from the fourth part of Chapter 5 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. You can find other resources on the clinical applications of RFT at languageasintervention.com. In this tutorial, you will learn about reinforcing progress step by step. So what we saw in previous tutorials is how we can use RFT principles to activate behavior change. We organize the activation of behavior change in three therapeutic processes. First, increasing functional contextual awareness. Then, promoting functional sense-making. And finally, increasing response flexibility. So these processes are useful to gain insights and begin to engage in new responses, but often changing a behavior requires more work. Even when clients are more aware of what they are doing and what influences their behaviors, even when they have a better sense of what would be most effective to do, and even when they have a bit more flexibility in their way of responding, they often need support to sustain these new responses and keep making progress. In order to help clients progress and stick with new effective responses, we can use the behavioral principles of shaping. Shaping consists of altering contextual variables to evoke and reinforce effective responses and to weaken or extinguish ineffective responses. In this area also, language is the main tool of therapists. So let's explore how we can help clients learn and consolidate new responses. The first principle of shaping behavior change is to reinforce effective responses progressively, step by step. Too often, people wait for perfect, optimal responses to occur before rewarding them. They may think that if they reward their own responses, or responses of others, too early, they will stop making efforts and progress toward even more effective responses. Or they may just miss opportunities to reinforce steps toward optimal responses because these responses don't naturally produce better outcomes yet. Imagine, for example, that a client is working toward more independence in her life and that her goal is to eventually be able to leave her parents' house and have a job. If we wait for this client to leave her house before reinforcing progress, this action may actually never occur because that's a pretty high goal for someone who is not yet independent. However, she may show smaller signs of independence earlier, such as expressing a different opinion from what the therapist is saying, or choosing herself an activity to practice being more independent. If these smaller steps are reinforced, then the client will gain self-efficacy and be encouraged to continue on this path to make bigger steps. In order to reinforce smaller steps, we need to be on the lookout for even subtle signs of progress. And often, we need to accept that ineffective behaviors are still present at the same time as the emerging effective response. For example, a client who has great difficulty naming and expressing his emotions and who criticizes others harshly when he feels anxious or sad might begin to say a few words about his feelings in the middle of a rant. That rant could be seen overall as ineffective, but inside of it, there are seeds of effective responses that need to be thoughtfully watered in order to grow further. So let's see in practice how we can use RFT principles to reinforce progress step by step. The first thing we can do to reinforce progress is help clients be more in touch with the reinforcing consequences of their effective actions by evoking observation. This can be done by using similar techniques as what we saw in assessment and increasing functional contextual awareness, but with a specific focus on reinforcing consequences. We can use conditional framing to directly draw the client's attention to the advantageous consequence of an action, for example by saying, "So, did you notice some improvement in your relationship when you listen more to your partner?" We can also use comparison framing to help the client notice progress, for example by asking, "Are there positive things that happen more as you begin to make decisions by yourself?" Perspective taking through dialectic framing can also help the client gain awareness of hidden positive consequences. For example, we could ask, "If you were your wife, would you have appreciated to hear these comments you made?" Another thing we can do is deliver natural reinforcing consequences through the therapeutic relationship. This approach is particularly relevant when clients are learning social responses. For example, A client might learn to talk more about his feelings as a way of increasing intimacy in relationships. In that case, a therapist could communicate that he feels closer to the client when he discloses personal information, like feelings and thoughts. When using this approach, however, we need to ensure that the consequences delivered in the context of therapy correspond to what is likely to happen in the client's life, or else the responses learned in therapy won't improve the client's well-being outside this context. Connecting therapy to the client's life is actually a major concern in each area of shaping behavior change. We need to generalize improvements happening in the therapy room to the client's life, and we want to observe in therapy the improvements made by clients in their lives outside, in order to reinforce them further. Thanks to the bidirectional nature of relational framing, it is possible to make these connections through the clinical conversation. When a client talks about events happening outside the therapy room, the therapist can help him observe the positive natural consequences of effective behaviors inside that distant context. Of course, reports of events are not always accurate. But if the therapist uses experiential techniques, observing and describing events that happen outside the therapy room can be more accurate. Concretely, the therapist asks questions that evoke observation, description, and tracking of positive consequences following effective behaviors, and encourages the clients to be as precise as possible, noting in particular the psychological experiences associated with these events, because they are often critical elements of the context that may be missed. So again, here, you can use the same techniques we saw in assessments and increasing functional contextual awareness. Another thing that we can do is help the client notice the similarities between what is happening in therapy and what may be happening in his life. For example, if a client begins to disclose more personal information, which leads to greater mutual understanding, the therapist can invite the client to explore if this kind of behavior is susceptible to increase mutual understanding in his life, for example, with his friends or his partner. So this is also something we saw when talking about assessment and functional contextual awareness, in particular with the use of analogical framing. Another main aspect of shaping behavior change is the reinforcement of tracking over appliance. The issue here is that we want clients to be reinforced by consequences that are not dependent on social approval. And given that therapy is by nature a social context, social contingencies arbitrarily applied can often inadvertently take over natural consequences. Concretely, when a client reports progress in his life, simply praising him could change the function of this new response. The client might engage in this new response only because of the therapist's approval. For this reason, instead of delivering arbitrary social reinforcement, we prefer helping the client notice the natural reinforcing consequences that happen as a result of his behavior. If the client struggles to notice these consequences, we can share our own observations, but always making sure that we link the client's behavior to its natural reinforcing consequences and checking if the client observes similar consequences on his own. For example, a therapist could say, "It seems that going to bed earlier has helped you be more rested during the day and has made your work easier. Is that what you experienced?" So reinforcing tracking over clients doesn't mean that clients should never be reinforced, though. In some cases, clients struggle too much to notice positive consequences of an effective behavior. And as a result, these consequences don't reinforce the behavior enough. This can happen when clients have strong impairments in awareness, such as in psychosis, attention deficit, or during acute episode of emotion deregulation. It might also happen when clients are highly depressed because in that case, consequences of effective behaviors are not yet experienced as positive. And finally, it can happen when the new effective responses are not well executed yet because the client needs to practice more, or these responses have not been applied for a long enough time to show positive outcomes yet. For example, a client who begins to share more personal information with others in order to increase intimacy with his friends might not see intimacy improve at first because his friends are not used to his new way of interacting. Only persistence will lead to positive outcomes in the long run. In all these cases, it can be useful to temporarily add social reinforcement to the natural consequences of new effective responses in order to strengthen them. Progressively, though, this added social consequence should be reduced to give more attention to the natural consequences as they become more visible. Concretely, a therapist could invite the client to trust her therapist's experience that improvement will eventually come. Or a therapist could intentionally praise a client's effort in order to make this effort more rewarding. Social approval is a powerful source of reinforcement. So praises from the therapist are likely to be reinforcing, especially if the therapeutic relationship is strong. Here is a summary of the main points you've learned in this tutorial and that I encourage you to remember. Shaping behavior change is often necessary to sustain improvements made in awareness, sense-making, and flexibility. Shaping behavior change consists of reinforcing effective responses and weakening or extinguishing problematic responses. Effective responses are often better shaped through step-by-step reinforcement. To reinforce progress step by step, you can evoke observation of reinforcing consequences, deliver reinforcing consequences, and connect therapy to the client's life. In the shaping process, it is better to reinforce tracking over appliance, except when natural positive consequences are still difficult to notice or not yet present in the client's life. And this is the end of this tutorial on shaping behavior change. This tutorial was adapted from the fourth part of Chapter 5 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. If you want to watch the next tutorial on shaping behavior change, focused on weakening problematic behaviors, you can go to languageasintervention.com. You will also find other resources on the applications of RFT for clinical practice.